Well, it is 6:30, so why don't we get started? And I know more people will be coming on board. For those of us that have joined us, we're so glad you joined us for our second earthLINES chat with Gabe Vasquez and Kevin Bixby. I'm Joanne from the Santa Fe Conservation Trust, and before I introduce Kevin and Gabe, I do want to alert you to that little icon at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. You can type in questions, we'll see them, the panelists and I will see them throughout the chat. We don't know if we'll get to all of them, but toward the end of the chat, we will get to as many as we possibly can. So feel free to be typing in those questions. That's, that always makes webinars a lot of fun to see what's on people's minds and to see what is generated from the conversation between Gabe and Kevin. I'm actually going to read the background stories for both of these gentlemen because I found them fascinating and I'd like to read the whole thing. So I apologize for reading, but they are like stories. They read like stories in a way. Gabe Vasquez is a city councilor in Las Cruces and the founder of Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project. He's a passionate advocate for conservation, outdoor equity, and creating public policy that serves communities of color. Now, Gabe grew up in Mexico, where he learned the values of caring for land, air, water, and wildlife from his late grandfather, Javier, and father, Alfonso. He's also been known to fish for catfish in the Rio Grande when he was growing up, and he explored the ranchos of Chihuahua and the public lands of New Mexico. In previous roles, Gabe has served as the executive director for the Las Cruces Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, as a staff member for U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich, as a communications and policy expert for the DC-based First Focus Campaign for Children, and as the Community Outreach Director for the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. Gabe has worked on successful local, state, and federal policy in the fields of immigration, social justice, child welfare, housing and poverty, and is the co-creator of the New Mexico Outdoor Equity Fund, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Gabe currently serves as an advisory board member for the New Mexico Division of Outdoor Recreation, as a board member of the Outdoor Alliance, and as a former Latino Outdoors Ambassador. He calls Southern New Mexico home, where he enjoys fishing, hunting, hiking, camping, and trail running with his dog, Suki. Can't get better than that, right? Kevin Bixby is the executive director of the Southwest Environmental Center. As the son of a naval officer, Kevin grew up all over the world, but the American West has always been home to him. While attending high school in Oakland, he began his activist career by volunteering at the Berkeley Ecology Center. After graduating with a BA in biology from Dartmouth College in '78, he returned to the San Francisco Bay Area and began volunteering at Friends of the Earth, where he rubbed elbows with the late, great David Brower. Lucky you. Working to save condors and whales by day, Kevin made a living by driving a San Francisco taxi cab at night. Realizing that more education might be useful, he set off to the School of Natural Resources at the University of Michigan in 1985, where he earned a master's degree in natural resources policy. But the West beckoned, and in 1988, Kevin moved to New Mexico with his future wife, Lisa LaRoque, and started the Southwest Environmental Center in 1991. The mission of the Southwest Environmental Center is to protect wildlife and their habitats in the Southwest through grassroots advocacy, education, and on-the-ground restoration projects. I enjoyed reading your backgrounds, and I do think they're fascinating. So we're so grateful that both of you could join us tonight. There's so many things that we could talk about tonight. But I wonder if you could just touch upon a few, and then we'll see where the questions lead us. So we know, one of the things I know you'll touch upon is we know that nature is declining, that there's an unprecedented extinction crisis right now. And we'd love to hear how wildlife specifically fits into the larger 30 by 30 initiative and what's happening with wildlife through this extinction crisis. 30 by 30, most of our audience probably knows what that is, but it's an initiative that will aims at protecting 30% of America's land and ocean areas by 2030. The other thing we'd love you to touch upon is what it means to address diversity and inclusion in a comprehensive way, including wildlife and species and people, and how we need to address this to protect wildlife and the environment, and why it's so important to get youth involved in this effort as well. And then finally, just, how local conservation efforts fit into 30 by 30 and what are some of your local conservation efforts or others that you've heard of. It's a lot to unpack, but I'm going to leave it to you to jump in, and maybe we can touch upon those and we'll see where it goes. So I will be back during the question and answer period. Thank you so much and welcome both.
Kevin, kick it off.
Well, thank you, Joanne. And Gabe, do you want to take the first 5 hours and I'll take the second? Those are some big questions.
Absolutely, Kevin. I'll let you get us started here. I know that you are. I know you have a mass extinction event tattooed like on your arm. So I think you should perhaps start with tackling that, and then we can move forward the conversation from there.
Yeah, it's right below the Megatherium drawing, giant ground sloth. Embarrassing. Well, I see some familiar faces. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight for this online chat or cocktail hour depressing topic. No, it's just hopefully it won't be too depressing. I mean, the world is in such a world of hurt, and the big focus is on climate change these days. I mean, that is an existential threat to humanity, to organized civilization. But there's another big existential threat that doesn't get as much airtime, and that's the mass extinction crisis. We're losing species and this is probably nothing new for most of the people watching, but we're losing species at such a rapid rate due to human activities, from habitat fragmentation and destruction and overharvesting and poisoning. It just goes on and on. And as with the climate crisis, scientists tell us that we have a very limited amount of time to avoid losing much of the world's biological diversity. And the metrics are just so depressing. There's an estimated 1 million species that are in danger of extinction. Since the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, North America has seen a almost 30% drop in bird numbers, nearly 3 billion birds. Around the world, the populations of terrestrial vertebrates, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians have declined by almost 70% across the globe. Insect numbers are plummeting. Scientists call this a biological annihilation, and warn that we have to take urgent action to stop it. And it's happening everywhere. It's happening in New Mexico, in the United States, around the world. So 30 by 30 is actually an interim step to getting to 50 by 50, which means managing 30% of the world's land surface and waters with the primary goal of protecting biological diversity. Doesn't mean you can't have other uses in those areas. It just means that has to be the primary goal. And that's 30% by the year 2030. So that's 9 years away. The clock is definitely ticking. And that's an interim step towards getting to 50 by 50, which is 50% of land and water by 2050. And there's a lot of science behind this. And the scientists say if we can do this, we can maybe we can preserve 80% of the world's biodiversity. You know, we're not going to save it all. We're not going to save it all. But given, you know, the trajectory of human activity and the trajectory of human population, that's the minimum that we need to do. And so that's going to require a real reckoning and really soul searching and abrupt course change in how we manage our lands in the United States, whether it's public lands or private lands, what our wildlife policies are. And fundamentally, for it to succeed, we have to change our relationship to nature. And it's a really tall order, but that's the way out. You know, we are facing a crisis, and that's what we need to do. So I'll turn it over to Gabe with that depressing introduction.
No, thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And Joanne, thank you for inviting us to be part of this chat. Thank you to the Santa Fe Conservation Trust. We are coming to you here from Las Cruces. These are the ancestral homes of the Jornada Mogollon and current home of the Piro Manso Tiwa, also homes of the Mescalero Apache and the Suma people. And so I think it's important to mention that because, Kevin, as you mentioned, this is really a global extinction crisis, but here in the United States in particular, when I think about the reason why we're here and why we got here, you know, I think about policies like Manifest Destiny, right? I think about how the capitalist, white male-dominated system of westward expansion and natural resource exploitation constructed this entire situation that we're on, at least in the United States, right? Of course, Western values and Western capitalism, and even if you want to go as far as Western democracy, has permeated throughout much of the world, and our standard of living has been set to a certain degree that has been emulated, right, to what we've been able to create here in the United States, but it has come at a cost, right? It has come at a price. Before the United States proper, before we became a nation, and when the Native people were here, as stewards, as conservationists of this land, and I've had the privilege of having many conversations with our brothers and sisters from our tribal communities here in New Mexico, is that natural resource and wildlife management was not just a natural thing that came to folks, but it was a necessary way of living. It was just the way of life, right? You knew that you had to pass things on, not just to the next generation, but to 7 generations after you. And so I think the part for me that is really important when having this conversation is recognizing first that that is what got us here. And that when we talk about diversity, access, equity, and inclusion, that it's not just because we have created an unfair socioeconomic system in this country that has given the privilege of certain people to have access to beautiful public lands and public spaces, and even the enjoyment of things like hunting and fishing and wildlife viewing and birding, but that there's alternate ways of living, that people carry with them different traditions and different ways of managing land that is not the traditional, you know, kind of capitalist dominated male white supremacist system of natural resource extraction and exploitation. And so I think that's important. I think hopefully that's something that I get to add to this conversation. And in 30 by 30, as you mentioned, Kevin, it's an unraveling and undoing of so many of these things, right? Like we are now struggling to protect landscape scale habitat for a variety of different species so that we can recover all those things that we've lost. But I will say it's also an opportunity to bring different perspectives in about land management, and not just that, but in terms of the socioeconomic change, to bring forth actual land managers and decision makers, and you know, folks that are going to be more reflective and diverse and truly embody who we are as a country, into who are tasked with actually carrying these out, right? Whether they're restoration projects, whether it's policy, whether it's young people managing wildlife at state agencies, the norm has to change in order for us to change. And so access, equity, and opportunity to me are part of that key that gets us to where we want to get in terms of reversing some of the impacts of the extinction crisis, or mitigating the impacts if we can't. Yeah, with that, I'll turn it back to you, Kevin. I wonder what your thoughts are on 30 by 30 in particular, because I know there's an executive order by the Biden-Harris administration that was issued, essentially tasking the Department of Interior to come up with a framework of what 30 by 30 actually means, right? And there's a key word there is conserve, right? What does conserve mean and where? So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that and how you think that shakes out.
Well, I completely agree with you, Gabe, on what you said. We need new voices. What the problem that we're facing with, the planet, climate change, and the mass extinction crisis is in large part a function of a colonial, mentality that has been exported around the world, where, white males feel like, predominantly, not exclusively, feel that it has been okay to dominate others, whether it's people of color or women or indigenous peoples or wild animals. And that legacy we see today in so many ways. And in one area that I'm very aware of its legacy is in our system of wildlife management in the United States. For those of you who don't know, the states have lead jurisdiction. Traditionally, they've taken primary jurisdiction over wildlife within their boundaries. The federal government has jurisdiction over things like federally listed endangered and threatened species or migratory birds. But for everything else, it's the purview of the states to determine how those animals are used and protected or not protected. And the people making those decisions in this system are predominantly white men, and particularly hunters. And Gabe is an avid hunter, and I'm an occasional hunter, so it's not an anti-hunting critique. It's just that that's a particular group of people that has control over the system, and that's a very small group of people because it's only 5% of the United States that hunts, and hunters tend to be older white men. So, and that's the legacy of that system of wildlife management that's developed in the United States, is based on those notions of superiority and domination and exploitation. We need new voices in that system, whether they hunt or not. We need new voices. We need indigenous voices. And it's great that Deb Haaland is now at the helm of, she's Secretary of Interior. She has a huge challenge ahead of her, to turn this ship around. It's a huge agency, and it's got a huge, huge responsibility over, tribal affairs and public lands and wildlife. So it's just a huge job, and we need to help her in however we can. But you're absolutely right, Gabe. We do need new voices into this system. And one way in particular that could happen is to demand that in every state there are these wildlife commissions that either oversee or advise the state wildlife agencies. So they're really important bodies, and they're predominantly traditional hunters. We need to get new voices onto those commissions, and they're usually appointed by the governor. And just to give an example, when Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham came in, she appointed, we have a 7-member game commission in New Mexico. She appointed 7 new members, and they were all hunters. And again, remember, the hunters are not the only people interested in wildlife. A legitimate group, voice, opinion, viewpoint for sure, but they should not be every member of the commission. We need other voices on there. And yeah, I'll turn it back to you, Gabe.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. I will perhaps just progress here to one of the questions that was just asked by Julia that I don't think, Kevin, you or I perhaps have the specific answer to. But it does, I think, push us in the direction of talking about what 30 by 30 is and why it's, this new overarching umbrella about around conservation. And so Julia asks about the Gunnison Prairie dog and it being nearly perhaps a threatened or endangered species. Not sure. She just mentions a listed species. But in terms of what the city of Santa Fe can do to preserve Gunnison's prairie dog habitat when it makes decisions about development of particular land, that's a great question, right? And that gets to the very granular level of what this 30 by 30 initiative means and represents for this administration. I will talk from my personal experience in that, protecting landscape scale habitat has been the priority of past administrations that have had a conservation agenda, in particular, President Obama, but even going as far back, obviously, as President Clinton, in which the Antiquities Act was used to declare, national monuments like Rio Grande del Norte or Organ Mountain Desert Peaks National Monument. And much of that argument was around, making sure that there was both wildlife habitat and connectivity, but also obviously ensuring that that land could not be developed for other purposes in the future, and mostly land that's already under federal control, either managed by, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, and so that at the very local level is just as important, right? And so what can cities do? What can counties do? What can states do at the granular level to make sure that even small parcels of habitat are protected? In the city of Las Cruces, we are trying to very much figure that out. The city often partners with the state land office and with the BLM on things like, development of water resources. Obviously, when new subdivisions get created, the BLM has a list of disposable land, right? Where it basically says, hey, this is the land that's suitable for a new housing development. But I've gone to some of these places and I'm like, wait, that's habitat for Gambel's quail, and it's just, and scaled quail, and and there's burrowing owls in there, and there's, right? But it has become disposable land. And so I don't have a specific answer to Santa Fe, Julia, but I will say that I think the 30 by 30 effort hopefully goes beyond what the administrations of the past have done and just looking at federal tracts of land, but really works with states, and then from states, hopefully down to municipalities, to actually address those very granular issues in different communities locally. Because this, I think, for this to be successful, it does have to have locally driven efforts. And so I am hopeful that that is what the Department of Interior and their guidance ends up providing to us, and also to organizations like the Santa Fe Conservation Trust that is tasked with working with private lands, right, on conservation easements and other types of hopefully permanent conservation opportunities on working in private lands. That those things are also added into this bucket of, what does it mean to conserve 30% of lands and waters by 2030? And it can't just be federal land. It has to include private land. It has to include city projects. It has to include, drainage ditches and arroyos and acequias and things that provide not just ecological resources to us, but the wildlife habitat that we've talked about, that is going to be key to help prevent or mitigate the impacts of this extinction crisis. So I'll leave it at that, turn it back to you, Kevin.
Yeah, and that raises a point that, it's going to require, to reach the incredibly ambitious goals of 30 by 30 and 50 by 50, it's going to take all hands on deck. It's going to take that sort of approach. And we have to match our wildlife policies with our land conservation policies. And I think the example of the Gunnison Prairie Dog is a good one, because in the state of New Mexico, Gunnison Prairie Dogs are not protected, nor are black-tailed prairie dogs. They're not protected under state law, and they were not listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So they are unprotected species. And I'm sad to say, that's a problem, because a lot of people like to shoot prairie dogs. They like to shoot them for target practice. And so it doesn't do any good if we are saying that BLM land, we're going to set aside Otero Mesa, the beautiful place behind me, one of the largest remaining desert grasslands in the United States. If we're going to, set it aside as a designated protected area and allow people to go out and shoot prairie dogs, and that's actually, there was a black-tailed prairie dog population out on Otero Mesa, and it's been in decline. So we need to do both. We need to protect the land and we need to protect the wildlife, because that is the purpose. That is one of the purposes of 30 by 30, is to address climate change, because natural areas are huge carbon sinks, but also to address the mass extinction crisis by providing places where biodiversity is the top priority. So, excellent question. And another example of that, and this is, of course, prairie dogs are keystone species, as are top carnivores like wolves. And I just wrote an essay about this today. The state of Wisconsin, so the Trump administration removed federal protections for gray wolves on January 5th, I believe, this year. And a lot of states immediately started planning, thinking about hunting wolves. And in the state of Wisconsin, they actually had a law on the books that mandates that there's a state organized hunt of wolves if they're ever delisted and no longer have federal protection. That happened. And the state wildlife agency was going to, per the law, plan a hunt for November. A group sued and a judge ruled with the group, and they said they had to start the wolf hunt almost immediately. So it was a very hastily arranged wolf hunt. And in the course of 3 days, at least 20% of the state's wolf population was killed. And that, I would be surprised if Gabe did not agree with me. This is not ethical hunting, because people are not eating wolves, and they're just killing them. I mean, they may use the pelts for something, but for the most part, they're just killing them because they don't like wolves. And that's just another example of how out of whack our wildlife policies are in the United States. Wolves are so important. Top carnivores are so important for the regulation and the maintenance of healthy, functioning ecosystems. So if our goal is to protect ecosystems and we allow for this slaughter of keystone animals, we need to get those in alignment.
I agree, Kevin. I completely agree. And yes, a complete shame from the Trump administration, along with so many, I believe, just detrimental policies that were rolled back during the Trump era that need to be reinstated. One bright spot for us is there is a tool called the Congressional Review Act that can be used when you do have a majority party in a bicameral fashion, right? So the Democrats have the House and Senate, and within the last, I believe it's, I think it's within the last 6 months that the administration takes, or a department takes, an executive action. It can be rolled back bicamerally by Congress. And so I know Senators Heinrich and Udall are leading in at least rolling back the methane rule standards that the Trump administration also rolled back. So there potentially is some opportunities through the Congressional Review Act, I know, to reinstate some of those administrative changes. And so that's a hopeful thing for us that is already being used. And so I will add that for some optimism. We do have a question here too, Kevin, that I want to address. And we don't have to go too much into it, but I do have strong feelings about this, because this issue about overpopulation and its taxing of the planet, I have heard this before, right? What is the carrying capacity of humans, right, on this planet? But I want to warn folks that I believe that sentiment is rooted in some very, very racist ideals. because overpopulation in general, I believe the conversation has really been rooted around what we consider to be third world countries. And coincidentally, it is people of color folks that have the ability or the means, right, or the cultural custom to only have one or two children. Like, it's very easy to judge folks for having a lot of kids, and we all come, I'm sure, from generations of varying degrees of Christian families where it was like a God-given right to procreate as much as you could, right? But slowly that changed over time as a cultural norm. Other countries haven't made that shift. But I just want to warn against that argument about, at least for me personally, it seems very offensive, because to me, it evokes an image of people of color having a lot of children, having big families, and that we are the problem. We're not the problem, right? I think we mentioned before that it is, if you break it down to the reason why we are in a climate change, it is these big national, multinational corporations exploiting and extracting natural resources, emitting giant sources of methane, in addition to, yes, large population centers emitting these products. But it has become in the best interest of these corporations to continue making these products, plastic and fuel and petroleum, right? When we as a human species have the opportunity to change that, but because it's now profit-driven industries, that is going to be very hard to do. And so I did just want to address that, because I will just say, look how it went for the Sierra Club, right? The Sierra Club in the early 1990s, late 80s, had a statement about overpopulation, and what it turned out to be was an anti-immigration manifesto almost, right? And as we're seeing, for example, today, the asylum seekers from Guatemala who are actually escaping climate-driven economic changes in their country through policies that the United States created, like NAFTA, making their products less competitive, and essentially wiping out their agricultural industry, or the viability of their agricultural industry. It is the very own policies of white leaders who have created this massive influx of refugees and asylum seekers coming from countries like Guatemala and El Salvador. And so we need to be pointing the finger at ourselves as a country when we talk about immigration and asylum seekers and what drives some of these things. And so that is just my personal perspective, but I just thought that I would talk about that. Yes, do more humans have more of an impact? Absolutely. But I think it's much deeper than just, India or China or Mexico or Guatemala or other countries having too many kids.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think there is a carrying capacity for humans on the planet, and and I'm sure we've crossed it. I don't think, there have been calculations that if everybody lives like an American, we're going to need, like, I don't know, 5 more Earths, so it's not, we cannot continue to live like we do in the developed world. And to tie that to the immigration issue is such a mistake, because it really doesn't matter where the people are living, it's how they're living. And so, a little back history, Gabe and I have worked for the last 4 years quite a bit on the border wall issue. We've gone and talked to, elected officials, and we've given presentations, and it's been great, because I've learned a lot about the immigration issue through that work. I mean, of course, I came at it from the standpoint of, sorry, there's this tremendous glare off a window in my house. It's now catching me as the sun goes down. So yeah, but I mean, I think the way we solve the population problem is we give people, especially women, we give women opportunities. We give them education, we give them opportunities, birth control, we give them control of their lives. And the same and it's with all people, not just women, but particularly with women. And then, in the developed world, we should incentivize having fewer children. I'm just amazed. I just read a story that in America, in the United States now, we've reached a point of increase where our population will start to decline, which I think is news for celebration. but the media presents it as a problem. We need to deal with this. We're not going to have enough workers to pay provide Social Security for people like me. But beyond that, it's how we live. It's how we live. We can't all eat so much meat as we do here in the United States, and we can't we can't continue to mine the oceans of all the life there. And also, I just want to get back to the issue of justice. This is where I think there's intersection between environmental, wildlife, land conservation, and social justice, because I think fundamentally what we need to do to save ourselves and to save the planet is to agree that other creatures besides Homo sapiens deserve our justice. They deserve to be treated with respect as if they have their own rights to exist, and not as our resources or to be exploited. And the same with the land and sorry. And so, fundamentally, I see this as a social justice issue.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Kevin. And I think that perspective of both wildlife, but also water, all flora, our clean air, our mountains being our relatives is something that we could really learn from indigenous tribal communities, right? In the way that they have traditionally managed land. Where rivers do have rights, where rivers are not just natural resources, but they are part of a community. They are, as many Native American folks call them, relatives that I have been blessed to learn in terms of the ethic of natural resource and land management from our very own Pueblo and Dene people here in New Mexico. And so that again brings me, I think, to that point about the diversity in folks who are making those decisions, and having Secretary Holland of Laguna Pueblo in essentially the most significant land management agency with BLM and all the things that are tasked under the Department of Interior, including our oceans, making some key decisions for us about the future of our lands and water is a huge dynamic shift. I mean, it is, not even mentioning that there's not ever been a Native American in charge of tribal relations between the federal government and tribes. Is a whole other giant accomplishment on its own for this country. But even just that ethic in wildlife and land management and how we relate to the natural world, there is a much different perspective in Native communities. And even, for me, as you mentioned, as somebody who grew up seeing my grandfather hunt for sustenance, right? He had 11 kids, and he hunted in Chihuahua Sierra Madre, not for no other reason than to just bring some meat for all the kids that he had to feed. And so I had a much different, it wasn't a recreational thing for my family when we grew up hunting. It was like, what are we going to eat for the next 2 months kind of thing, right? Of course, that has shifted and that has changed, and it has become a cultural value that's ingrained in me, but I still carry those values of you never kill anything you're not going to eat, as you mentioned about wolves earlier, right? And you never fish anything you're not, don't be prepared, right? If you're gonna kill something, you better be prepared to eat it and eat it all. And so yes, I think those are different styles of being in relation with land and with people and with wildlife that different perspectives can carry if those folks are given the opportunities to get into those decision-making posts. And so that's why it's also really important, I think, to get more diverse young people involved. And this is true across New Mexico. And I think this is the impetus for creating the New Mexico Outdoor Equity Fund, right? For me, the 30,000 foot level was like, how do we create more people of color in the state to care for our natural resources, for our wildlife, our water, and our air? Well, I can probably assume, and I will, that all of us have had some magnificent experiences on public lands, on state lands, on private lands that we can point to say, I love wildlife because I had these transformational experiences with wildlife. I love the mountains because I've been, to Wheeler Peak, and I got to see the sunset, and I got, you know, and so when young people that don't have privilege, that don't have access, that don't have transportation in our state, don't have access to those opportunities, they lose out on even seeing that as a career path. And so I think just to make that connection of I think how we relate to the land, water, and wildlife differently is bringing in these different perspectives, and that requires investment, and it requires, you know, tackling some of those barriers that currently exist. And so that's some of the work that's really the reason why we also created Nuestra Tierra, as you know, Kevin, and then have also worked on the border wall issue, not just from the humane immigration side, right? Looking at the border wall as a weapon. It's essentially a weapon meant to kill immigrants, right? Because the further immigrants have to walk around a wall, the higher degree and the higher possibility that they're going to die, and the immigrants will not stop coming. So it's literally a tool to kill people, but it's also, as you know, I mean, it creates the most unhospitable conditions for a variety of different species that potentially result in their temporary or permanent decline. Who knows? But that's also not good. Walling off an entire continent is not good for our wildlife, and you don't need a scientist to tell you that. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. And Kevin, I know there's some questions that are popping up too, if you want to tackle one of these that just came up.
Yeah. I just want to say, going to agree that we need more indigenous voices if we're going to get ourselves out of this mess. The science behind 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 is laid out in an article called The Global Deal for Nature. It was a 2019 article, came out in Science Advances, I believe it is. Yeah, Science Advances 2019. And it goes into great detail about how this approach, 30 by 30 and 50 by 50, can address both climate change and the mass extinction. And it identifies, you know, ecoregions that and assesses how much of those areas are already protected, how much more need to be protected. And it turns out that a lot of the areas that are key for that we need to protect are under tribal control. You know, in the Amazon and in Canada and you know, across the globe. So you know, tribes are going to be key to protecting all of us, and we really need to. And they've been protecting their land, and so we need to have them at the table to help us, you know, with the job. I want to push back on one question I saw about humans living in harmony for 200,000 years. You know, I just don't think that's true. I mean, if you look at the history of Homo sapiens and wildlife interactions for the past 100,000 years, it's been bad news. And you know, these are people that were hunting to survive. Clearly, you know, they weren't hunting from a an industrial or colonial perspective. They were just doing what they needed to do. But in that course of time, a lot of animals disappeared, a lot of species disappeared. We lost, in North America, for example, we lost 74% of large animals, defined as those larger than 80 pounds. In South America, 82%. In Australasia, we lost 71%. In Europe, 59%. So, you know, it's just been this long trajectory of humans having this impact on wildlife. Of course, when humans came to the Americas, they encountered a lot of large animals who had never seen Homo sapiens before and were easily killed. And there may have, and that's a hotly debated topic, and there may have been some climate issues as well. But things really accelerated, when Europeans arrived in North America and began, to decimate our wildlife populations in sort of an industrial scale. But I do want to just push back on the idea that humans have always lived in harmony with other species, because I don't think that's actually the case. How about Gabe? Are there more questions on the?
Yeah, there's a good question here. And I know you and I have talked about that, Kevin. We can talk about that later. I'd argue we're animals too. But there's a question here about the planning process for what should be preserved or conserved at the state level, taking place for 30 by 30. What is taking place at the state level, and do we need legislation? Thank you for that question. I will just say that I think the first step for me, looking at this through a policy lens, it would be an executive order from our governor stating this is a priority, but also including some directives in the executive order that would help to create some synergy between our various departments, energy, mineral, natural resources, certainly our environment department and our game commission, to come up with a framework of what it means to actually reach that 30% of lands and waters in New Mexico, so that would include perhaps the foundation for policy or legislation. Because I think as we've talked here in the beginning about preserving or conserving lands, especially working lands or private lands, it's more akin to what the Conservation Trust does. You need to find a way to pay for it, right? And so, yes, how is the state going to raise the dollars to even match federal dollars through the Land and Water Conservation Fund or other mechanisms to be able to acquire the types of lands that will help meet this 30% goal? But additionally, yes, can local municipal projects, for example, that restore a ditch bank or that set aside open space in an urban area, can those particular projects on the ground also count towards the 30 by 30 goal? I would argue that they could, but I think it needs to start with some leadership from the governor, recognizing that this is important to our state and that people want to have this, and then really tasking the different departments, I think, to come up with this framework that then allows legislators to do their work to help meet these goals, but also local communities, right? City councils and counties and different and even folks in the trust and private land ownership world that can say, yes, we are contributing to this goal, and here are the metrics. So that's my thoughts on maybe how we begin to just actually flesh this out at the state level a little bit. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, I agree. There's so many paths that we need to take to approach this goal, because it's so ambitious. We definitely need some policy changes. Just to give one example, I mentioned that prairie dogs are not protected under state law. Not only that, that means that our state wildlife agency, the Department of Game and Fish, does not have the authority to manage prairie dogs, even if it wanted to. So that means that, one landowner can take care of prairie dogs and take the transfers from the city of Santa Fe if they need a place to go, and their next door neighbor can be killing them all, poisoning them all. So we need to give our wildlife agency, we need to take off the handcuffs. They need to be able to have the authority to step in and protect all species, not just the subset that are currently protected. An example of another group that is not protected are most of our bats. In case you didn't know, New Mexico has one of the highest levels of biodiversity of all the states. We're second in the number of birds and third in the number of mammals and reptiles. So we have a lot of biodiversity here in our state, and we really need to make it the policy of the state to protect all species and give our state wildlife agency the authority to do that. And then I think another thing that's really key, we need a whole host of incentives for private landowners. I think we need to work with the federal land managers on BLM and national forest lands. But we also need to bump up, education about the importance of biological diversity. You know, I'm just continually astounded. I've been in this line of work for 30 years, and the general lack of awareness or understanding of how the natural world works and the importance of ecology and biological diversity. I just don't think we emphasize that enough in our educational system.
Yeah, Kevin, I agree with that, and I also recognize we are the poorest state in the country, and so it's not that we have a bad educational system. I think, oftentimes because of the societal conditions that our families find themselves in, it never becomes a priority, right? It's never it's never in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like what comes top of mind to young students in our in many of our communities, nor in our education system, and that does need to change. And I think hopefully programs like the Outdoor Equity Fund help youth, right, like understand and unlock the secrets of the natural world in a way that gets them interested in learning about biological diversity and hopefully leading to careers. But not just that, the advocacy side of things too, right? Like we need more people, we need more voters and more constituents out there caring about these issues. And I think you're right. It has to start in our schools. In terms of that education piece of it. So hopefully we're heading there. I know that there's some great environmental ed educators out there. Hopefully, we're just able to secure, thanks to our legislature and the support of our governor, the tripling of the budget of the New Mexico Outdoor Equity Fund to somewhere right around $850,000, which will, be able to serve. Somewhere around like 25 to 30,000 kids in the state in what we call meaningful outdoor experiences, right? And so in a nature-based setting, so not like, not little league stuff, but actually playing in creeks and rivers and climbing mountains and doing all that good stuff that hopefully gets students interested. I think we're making hopefully some progress towards that end. Kevin, I know we are getting close to time, and so I am wondering if there are some questions in here that you want to address or anything that you want to chat about before we get close to our end of the hour here.
I did see one about the border wall. And this is probably something you can chime in on too, Gabe, but there was a question asked, and I just want to mention, I think the Outdoor Equity Fund is so significant, and Gabe really deserves a lot of the thanks for getting that done. And I did notice that in President Biden's infrastructure package that there's, I think it's $2 billion for a civilian conservation corps, which I think is fantastic because those are a lot of jobs, restoring the landscape and getting people outdoors. So I think that's going to be very helpful too if it passes. There's a question about, is there a plan to remove the border wall in New Mexico? Well, there is an effort underway, and the administration did succeed in building a new border wall along much of our border with Mexico, blocking off some really important wildlife corridors. There is an effort to get the attention of the Biden administration to look at places where the wall should be taken down, where it's harming wildlife or where it's harming, where it's on sacred tribal lands or for other reasons. And I noticed that Brian Bird is on this call, and he is very much involved in spearheading that effort. Yeah, and I know the New Mexico Attorney General's office is also interested in that process as part of a settlement of their lawsuit against the Trump administration to stop the wall. Gabe, do you have anything to add to that? Do you have any information?
Yes, there needs to be some, there absolutely needs to be some action taken, especially to mitigate the impacts of the construction that was abruptly halted, thank God. Because as you probably know, in areas where the border wall was halted through executive action by the Biden administration, essentially the dozers and the water tanks and everything was taken down 2 or 3 days, before the executive order went into effect and left just, I mean, some of the most, just disgusting abuses of land and water, not just in New Mexico, but certainly across amazing places like the Sky Islands in Arizona, the Guadalupe Mountains in particular. So all that stuff needs to be cleaned up, first of all, right? I mean, that is just a danger not to just to wildlife, but to humans too, right? Because we recreate on those lands as well. So I think that needs to be, step number one, and perhaps the Conservation Corps has a role to play in that. But yes, because so many laws are waived in the construction of the wall, like through the Secure ID Act and the Real ID Act and the Secure Fences Act. No analysis was ever done, right, on where it was both ecologically or culturally sensitive to build the wall. And I think those analyses need to be retroactive. They need to be done. And for me, I don't think a wall belongs on any part of this continent, from, the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. We don't need a wall. But yes, let's prioritize those areas that are especially ecologically sensitive to the migration of species and to the habitat of species. That's really important. The more proactive thing I think we can begin to do is also begin to protect permanently those landscapes on the border that are of ecological importance, like in New Mexico's Boot Heel, like in the Beloncillos and the Chiricahua Mountains, wilderness study areas, right, that are down there that need to be either made permanently into wilderness by Congress, or perhaps through executive action can be turned into a national monument that afford those lands additional protection, so that we safeguard the habitat that we do have, the lands that we do have. And there are folks working on that. Nuestra Tierra is working on that. In places like El Paso, I mean, there's a proposal for Kastner Range National Monument, which is just at 8,000 acres, but it's part of the Franklin Mountain chain, right? That is essentially border life habitat. So in addition to tearing down the wall, there are still some really unique and beautiful places on the border that we can protect in this current political environment, hopefully.
Well, I'm going to ask if either one of you wants to tackle that question on green energy. Can you see that one? Julia says green energy is good for many reasons. This will probably be the last question we can get to. Green energy is good for many reasons, but wind turbines kill birds, solar panels need space. That might be considered wasteland, but it's certainly wildlife habitat. And it seems like it will be a new footprint on our public lands, which can't necessarily use the same footprint where oil and gas are now. Julia's wondering your thoughts on this.
Gabe, you want to talk
Sure.
about it?
Yeah, and this is a great question, and I think undoubtedly there will be impacts from green energy development to the environment, to wildlife, to habitat in New Mexico, and really across anywhere where you have significant solar and wind resources. That's undoubtable. I guess we have to. For me, it's a question of what the trade-off is, right? What are the methane emissions that are released and ultimately contribute to global warming, releasing of greenhouse gases? And there's no easy answer. Both are detrimental to the actual development in the way that they are actually developed. And even this conversation around building transmission lines, right, throughout the state. Zanzia or the South Line project have massive environmental impacts associated with them. To me, it's like, what is the alternative? Is the alternative to continue on this fossil fuel extraction path that I believe exponentially causes more damage to people, to water resources, perhaps permanently, and that continues to promulgate this culture of, just using plastics and using oil and using petroleum products to power our quality of life that we've decided we value so much in this country, that we need to have those things. To me, those renewable energy resources begin to get us away from that mentality and begin to get us away from that incredible amount of methane that is emitted into the atmosphere. So while those problems do exist, I think it's a step in the right direction. Do I think it could be done better in a more ecologically sustainable way? Absolutely, because it's going to be the same capitalist system that's going to drive the production and the establishment of these projects that drives oil and gas, right? The same investors are going to be going from one thing to another. And that means that the ecological or conservation is not going to be their priority. It's going to be return on investment. And so unfortunately, that probably won't change, but I think the impact overall to climate change perhaps will change through the development of these resources.
I would just add that very quickly, we need to get away from the use of fossil fuels. It's killing us. It's killing the planet, but mostly it's killing human civilization because it's just going to cause such massive disruption. But I don't think human convenience or well-being is worth the trade-off if we're, harming other species. I mean, you have to look at the scale, of course, but I think we ought to be moving towards a distributed energy production system where every building has solar panels on the roof. We're not putting up massive, installations that fry birds or, harm bats and birds on a massive scale. We need to move away from that sort of thinking because that is very human centric. Our needs come first, and that's what got us into the mess in the first place. So I agree with Gabe. It's a step in the right direction, but we have to keep moving forward. And I just read about some wind turbines that don't actually have blades. They just kind of are these poles that sort of wobble in the wind and produce energy, and you can put them on your roof. So I think that's pretty exciting. So, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. And I, again, want to thank Gabe and Kevin for spending an hour with us here. It was enlightening. And I wish we had more time because I know your backgrounds and I know what you can bring to the table and the conversations that you can have because I've been fortunate enough to sit with you once before. So we will be recording this. I'll send you the recordings for those watching. And if you know somebody that missed tonight, we will get this recording up either on our YouTube channel or on our website. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everybody out there and for all of your questions as well.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you to
Thank you for having us.
Enjoy your evening. Everybody out there, enjoy your evening as well. Take care.